11,000 years ago, someone stood on the shore of a lake that sits more than 7,000 feet above sea level, in a landscape still scarred by retreating glaciers, and lost a weapon. Or discarded it, or cached it for a return trip that never happened. Whatever the reason, a single stone projectile point, shaped in a style that archaeologists associate with some of the earliest known inhabitants of North America, ended up in the sediment along the southern edge of Yellowstone Lake. And it stayed there, buried and forgotten, for roughly 110 centuries. That artifact is one of the oldest confirmed traces of human presence ever found inside Yellowstone National Park. But it is far from the only surprise hidden in this landscape. Most people who hear the word Yellowstone think of geysers. They think of the supervolcano. They think of bison and elk and boiling mud and the vaguely unsettling knowledge that an enormous magma system sits a few miles beneath their feet. What almost nobody thinks about is the human story, the 11,000-year record of people who lived, worked, hunted, traveled, camped, bled, and died across this volcanic plateau long before the first tourist ever arrived. That story includes dozens of prehistoric quarries carved into a cliff of volcanic glass. It includes stone circles left behind by ancient camps that most visitors would walk right past without noticing. It includes enormous hunting structures stretching nearly 200 meters across mountain terrain, engineered to guide animals toward waiting hunters. It includes archaeological evidence found on islands in the middle of Yellowstone Lake, raising the question of how anyone reached them. It includes a campsite from one of the most desperate episodes in 19th century American history, preserved almost untouched at nearly 3,000 meters of elevation. And it includes a cemetery, just steps from one of the park's most popular areas, where the dead still lie in the ground. None of this is secret in the conspiratorial sense. Archaeologists have published their findings. The National Park Service manages and protects these sites. But the sheer weight of Yellowstone's geological spectacle has buried this human history so thoroughly that most visitors, and most people who watch documentaries about the park, have never heard any of it. That changes now. We start where the story starts, at the edge of a lake, with a weapon that is older than the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 6,000 years. The southern shore of Yellowstone Lake is not an easy place to reach, and it was not an easy place to reach 11,000 years ago either. The lake sits on the Yellowstone Plateau at an elevation of about 7,733 feet, nearly a mile and a half above sea level. Winters here are brutal. Temperatures regularly drop well below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow can fall in any month of the year. The growing season is short. The terrain is unforgiving. At the end of the last ice age, conditions were even more extreme. Large portions of the Yellowstone Plateau had been covered by glacial ice during the late Pleistocene. As the climate warmed and the glaciers retreated, the landscape that emerged was raw, unstable, and treeless in many areas, a high-altitude environment that would have challenged even experienced travelers. And yet people were already there. The projectile point recovered from the southern shore of Yellowstone Lake belongs to what archaeologists call the Clovis tradition. This is one of the earliest widespread stone tool technologies identified in North America, generally dated to a window between roughly 13,000 and 12,700 years ago, though the exact boundaries of that range are still actively debated. Clovis points are distinctive. They are bifacially flaked, shaped on both sides, and they feature a characteristic channel or flute removed from the base, a technique that required considerable skill and that serves as one of the primary ways archaeologists identify the tradition. The work was carried out in connection with research involving the University of Montana, part of broader archaeological investigations around Yellowstone Lake that have gradually expanded understanding of early human use of the park's interior. Now here is where precision matters. The artifact was identified as Clovis based on its form, its shape, flaking pattern, and that diagnostic flute. This is what archaeologists call typological dating. The stone itself was not directly dated through radiocarbon analysis because stone cannot be radiocarbon dated. There was no associated charcoal hearth, no organic material sealed in the same deposit that could provide an independent date. What researchers can say is that the point matches the Clovis technological tradition, and that tradition is associated with a well-established time period across North America. That makes the artifact approximately 11,000 years old, possibly older, with the understanding that approximately is doing real work in that sentence. What does a single projectile point actually tell us? Less than we might want, and more than we might expect. It does not prove that a permanent settlement existed on the shore of Yellowstone Lake during the late Pleistocene. A single artifact cannot do that. It could represent a brief stop during a longer journey. It could be evidence of a hunting foray into the high country. It could have been lost by a single individual who never returned. But what it does tell us is that someone, at least one person, and almost certainly part of a group, because surviving in this kind of environment alone would have been extraordinarily difficult, reached the interior of the Yellowstone Plateau during or shortly after the final retreat of glacial ice. They carried with them a stone tool technology that connected them to a broader cultural tradition spread across much of the continent. And they did this thousands of years before the construction of Stonehenge, thousands of years before the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, thousands of years before anyone planted the first domesticated wheat. The number of similarly ancient archaeological traces found within Yellowstone is small. This is partly because systematic archaeological survey of the park's interior, especially the remote backcountry, is still incomplete. The landscape is vast, access is difficult, and budgets for archaeological fieldwork in national parks have never been generous. But even the limited evidence that does exist makes one thing clear. The common assumption that Yellowstone's interior was essentially empty of people until modern times is wrong. People were moving through this volcanic landscape far earlier than most visitors would ever guess. And the artifact that proves it is a single piece of stone, smaller than a human hand, found on the shore of a lake that most tourists photograph from overlooks without ever knowing what lies beneath the surface of its history. About 30 miles north of Yellowstone Lake, there is a cliff that changed the economy of prehistoric North America. It does not look like much from a passing car. A dark, glassy exposure of rock along the road between Mammoth Hot Springs and Norris Junction. Most visitors who notice it at all register it as a geological curiosity, maybe slow down for a photograph and drive on. They are looking at one of the most important sources of tool-making material on the continent. Obsidian Cliff is exactly what its name suggests, a formation of obsidian, natural volcanic glass, exposed in a massive outcrop that has been drawing human visitors for at least 11,000 years. But calling it a cliff undersells the scale of what happened here. Archaeological surveys of the area have documented approximately 59 distinct quarry pits and workshop areas associated with prehistoric stone tool production. 59. This was not a place where someone occasionally picked up a sharp rock. This was an industrial landscape. To understand why, you need to understand obsidian itself. When silica-rich lava, the kind produced by Yellowstone's volcanic system, cools rapidly enough that its molecules cannot organize into a crystalline structure, the result is a natural glass. It fractures conchoidally, meaning it breaks in smooth, curved surfaces rather than along flat planes. A skilled knapper can control those fractures with extraordinary precision, removing thin flakes to create edges that are, at a microscopic level, sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. That is not an exaggeration. Obsidian blades have been measured at widths of just a few nanometers at the cutting edge, far thinner than the finest steel. For people whose survival depended on cutting, scraping, piercing, and butchering, high-quality obsidian was not a luxury. It was a strategic resource. And the obsidian at this particular cliff was exceptionally good. The Yellowstone volcanic system produced glass with relatively few inclusions, consistent fracture properties, and large enough nodules to allow the production of sizable tools and blanks. The 59 quarry pits and workshop areas tell a story of organized, repeated extraction over thousands of years. Archaeologists distinguish these from casual surface collection by their physical characteristics: deliberate excavation into the source rock, concentrations of manufacturing debris far denser than what random collection would produce, the presence of tested and rejected pieces alongside finished or nearly finished tools, and spatial patterns that indicate people were setting up work areas, not just grabbing whatever was loose on the ground. The sequence of work is visible in the debris. Large pieces of raw obsidian were extracted from the source. They were tested, struck to evaluate their fracture quality, pieces with flaws were discarded, and you can still find them. Suitable material was then reduced. Large flakes were removed to create roughly shaped blanks or preforms, which could be carried away for final shaping elsewhere. The sheer volume of waste flakes, shattered rejects, broken tools, and unfinished pieces left behind at Obsidian Cliff represents an almost incomprehensible quantity of human labor spread across millennia. But here is where the story gets genuinely remarkable, and where modern science transformed a local quarry site into evidence of continental-scale human networks. Obsidian from different volcanic sources has a distinctive chemical fingerprint. The precise ratios of trace elements, things like strontium, barium, zirconium, and rubidium, vary from one volcanic system to another. Using techniques such as X-ray fluorescence and neutron activation analysis, researchers can take a finished obsidian artifact found anywhere on the continent and determine, with high confidence, exactly which volcanic source produced the raw material. When they did this with Yellowstone obsidian, the results were staggering. Artifacts made from obsidian cliff material have been identified at archaeological sites across an enormous geographical range. We are talking about distances of hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 kilometers from the source. Yellowstone obsidian has turned up at sites across the Great Plains, in the Midwest, and in other regions far removed from the park. What does this mean? It means that Obsidian Cliff was connected to vast networks of human movement, trade, and exchange that spanned prehistoric North America. Whether individual travelers carried raw material or finished tools across those distances, or whether obsidian passed from group to group through successive exchanges, or whether some combination of both occurred, the result is the same. A cliff of volcanic glass in what is now northwestern Wyoming was linked to human communities living hundreds of miles away. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years before European contact, before horses, before metal tools, before written language existed anywhere in the Americas, a resource extracted from the interior of the Yellowstone volcanic system was circulating across a significant portion of a continent. The people doing this were not isolated bands stumbling through an empty wilderness. They were participants in exchange systems that required knowledge of geography, maintained social relationships across enormous distances, and moved high-value materials through networks we are only beginning to reconstruct. Obsidian Cliff is listed as a National Historic Landmark, but even that designation understates what this place represents. It is not simply an important archaeological site. It is physical proof that the human geography of prehistoric North America was far more complex, far more connected, and far more sophisticated than the story most of us were taught. And by the way, if you have ever wondered why some archaeological locations within national parks are not precisely marked on public maps, this is part of the reason. Sites like Obsidian Cliff, where the source material is well known, are already protected by their visibility and by law. But other, less prominent sites face real threats from unauthorized collection, looting, and disturbance. Federal law, specifically the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, makes it a crime to excavate, remove, or damage archaeological resources on federal land without a permit. The National Park Service does not publicize the exact locations of many sensitive sites, not because they are hiding something scandalous, but because experience has shown that publicity can lead directly to destruction. The forbidden knowledge, in most cases, is simply protected knowledge, and the protection exists because without it, the evidence disappears. Deep in the Montana portion of Yellowstone, in a landscape that most visitors never see, archaeologists documented something that sounds almost too modest to matter: 11 circles of stones. They are known as the airport rings, and they are among the most important archaeological features ever investigated inside the park. The circles range in diameter, and to an untrained eye, they look like nothing. Rocks arranged in rough rings on the ground, partially buried, some displaced by frost heave or animal activity, surrounded by grass and sagebrush. You could hike past them without a second glance. Thousands of people probably have. But those stones are the architectural remains of homes. Here is how it works. When people constructed a lodge, a conical dwelling covered with animal hides, supported by wooden poles, what many people would recognize as a teepee, they needed to secure the edges of the hide covering against wind. One common method was to weight the bottom edge with stones. When the camp was eventually abandoned, and the poles, hides, and belongings were taken away, the stones remained. Over decades and centuries, the organic materials, wood, leather, sinew, everything that made the structure a shelter, decomposed or was carried off. What survived was a ring of rocks, slowly sinking into the soil, gradually becoming part of the landscape. Archaeologists call these features teepee rings or stone circles, and they are found across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain West. But identifying them is harder than it sounds. Natural processes can arrange stones in circular patterns too. Frost action, tree root growth, erosion, and even burrowing animals can create formations that superficially resemble human-made circles. Distinguishing the real thing from the background noise requires careful analysis. The regularity of the circle, the size and type of stones, their relationship to the surrounding terrain, and, most importantly, what lies inside and beneath them. During the 2007 and 2008 field seasons, archaeologists excavated 3 of the 11 airport rings. What they found inside confirmed what the surface evidence suggested, and then some. 3 hearths, the remains of fires built inside the circles. Hundreds of stone artifacts, including flakes and tools that indicated people were not just sleeping here, but working, processing materials, making or repairing tools, performing the daily tasks of life. And animal remains, the bones of creatures that had been hunted, butchered, and consumed on the spot. The spatial relationships between these different types of evidence matter enormously. A hearth in the center of a stone circle, surrounded by tool-making debris and food remains, creates a pattern that is almost impossible to explain through natural processes. It is a domestic scene. Someone built a fire inside a structure, sat near it, ate, worked with stone tools, and discarded the waste. The arrangement is not random. It reflects the organized use of interior space by people who understood exactly how to set up a functional living area. What made this excavation particularly significant was its status. It represented the first archaeological excavation of a stone circle site within Yellowstone National Park. Despite the park's enormous size, more than 2 million acres, and despite decades of archaeological survey work, no one had previously dug into one of these features within the park's boundaries. The results challenged a persistent, if often unspoken, assumption. Yellowstone, in the popular imagination, is a place of nature, wild, pristine, untouched by human hands until the 19th century. The airport rings say otherwise. People were not just passing through this landscape. They were stopping, setting up structured camps, building fires, preparing food, manufacturing tools, and creating organized living spaces. They were inhabiting this environment in ways that are archaeologically visible and functionally identical to domestic life documented across the broader region. What do you think shaped the popular impression that Yellowstone was an empty wilderness before the park was created? Was it simply a lack of archaeological attention, or does the sheer spectacle of the volcanic landscape make it difficult to see the quieter evidence of human life? I would genuinely like to know your thoughts on that. Put your answer in the comments. The people who made the airport rings did not leave their names. The archaeological evidence, as currently published, does not allow confident attribution to a specific named group, and speculation would be irresponsible. What the evidence does allow is a conclusion that is powerful enough on its own. The volcanic interior of Yellowstone was not a void. It was a place where people lived. If the airport rings show us where people slept, the next discovery shows us how they ate, and it reveals a level of planning and environmental knowledge that is frankly humbling. In the Absaroka Mountains, along the rugged eastern margins of the greater Yellowstone region, researchers have documented remnants of something that most visitors would never recognize even if they were standing directly on top of it: large-scale communal hunting structures. Some of these features include long alignments of stones and vegetation extending roughly 200 yards, about 180 meters. To put that in terms you can picture, imagine a line of low, deliberately placed stones and brush stretching nearly the length of 2 American football fields, laid out across steep, broken mountain terrain at high elevation. These were not walls, they were not fences, they were not fortifications. And this is the part that requires a shift in thinking, because the engineering involved is not about brute strength. It is about psychology, animal psychology. The purpose of these alignments was to influence the movement of animals. Bighorn sheep and potentially other ungulates were the primary targets. The structures worked not by physically blocking an animal's path — a bighorn sheep could easily step over or around a low line of stones — but by creating a visual and psychological disturbance in the landscape. Animals moving across open terrain tend to follow the path of least resistance and to avoid unfamiliar obstacles. A line of stones, cairns, or brush piles especially one that converges toward a narrowing passage, can subtly guide a herd's movement without the animals ever recognizing that they are being directed. The converging lines funneled animals toward locations where hunters could intercept them more effectively: narrow defiles, cliff edges, natural traps, or positions where hunters waited in concealment. The system did not require every animal to follow the lines perfectly. It required only that enough animals be influenced enough of the time to make the hunt more productive than an unstructured approach. Recognizing these features today is extraordinarily difficult. After centuries of exposure to freeze-thaw cycles, snow loading, vegetation changes, erosion, rockfall, and the passage of countless wild animals, the surviving alignments are often barely distinguishable from natural distributions of rock. Individual stones may have shifted, sections may have been buried or scattered. Vegetation that once formed part of the structure has long since decayed. So how do archaeologists identify them? Several lines of evidence converge. The geometry of the alignments, their linear arrangement, their convergence toward topographic features favorable for hunting is one factor. Their relationship with the surrounding terrain is another. Natural rockfalls tend to scatter debris downslope in fan-shaped patterns. They do not typically produce long, narrow, converging lines that align with game trails and topographic funnels. The presence of associated artifacts, projectile points, butchering tools, animal bone concentrations, in the areas where the converging lines terminate provides supporting evidence, and the repetition of the same basic pattern across multiple locations suggests a shared cultural practice rather than a natural coincidence. What do structures approaching 180 meters in length imply? They imply knowledge. Detailed, specific, hard-earned knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal migration patterns, wind direction, terrain features, escape routes, and the psychology of herd movement. This was not something a single hunter improvised on a Tuesday afternoon. Planning and constructing these systems required understanding where animals would be at specific times of year, how they would react to disturbances, which terrain features could be exploited, and where to position waiting hunters for maximum effect. They also imply coordination. Building and using a hunting system this large requires multiple people working together, some constructing or maintaining the drive lines, some positioned at the terminus, some driving or disturbing the animals to initiate movement. This is organized communal labor directed toward a shared objective. The discovery preserves something that is rarely visible in the archaeological record. Usually, what survives from ancient hunts is the weapon, a projectile point embedded in bone, or a scatter of broken tools at a kill site. What the Absaroka hunting structures preserve is not the weapon, but the landscape itself, deliberately modified to make the hunt possible. It is the difference between finding a bullet and finding the entire battlefield. And the people who designed these systems understood their environment with a precision that modern wildlife biologists would recognize and respect. They were not wandering randomly through the mountains hoping to stumble across game, they were engineering the encounter. Yellowstone Lake is the largest high-elevation lake in North America. It covers about 136 square miles, sits at over 7,700 feet, and is cold, deep, and, for much of the year, extremely inhospitable. It also contains islands, and some of those islands have people on them, or rather, they had people on them, roughly 3,000 years ago. Archaeological investigations on islands within Yellowstone Lake have documented evidence of human activity stretching back approximately 3 millennia. The sites include artifact scatters, lithic debris, and other material consistent with temporary human occupation or use. The evidence is not massive in quantity, but its location makes it remarkable. Because the obvious question is immediate: how did people get there? The islands in Yellowstone Lake are not connected to the shore by land bridges. They are surrounded by open water, water that is dangerously cold even in summer. Surface water temperatures in Yellowstone Lake rarely exceed the mid-50s Fahrenheit and can be much colder at depth. Capsizing in water this cold is life-threatening within minutes. Reaching an island requires crossing a significant stretch of open lake, which means either possessing a reliable watercraft or finding an alternative route. The most straightforward explanation is boats. Indigenous peoples across North America developed a wide range of watercraft technologies: bark canoes, dugout canoes, bullboats made from animal hides stretched over wooden frames, and rafts of various construction. Any of these would have been theoretically capable of reaching Yellowstone Lake's islands, and there is nothing implausible about people who lived in and around the greater Yellowstone region possessing the skills and materials to build them. But there is another possibility that researchers have also considered: winter access across the frozen surface of the lake. Yellowstone Lake freezes over during the winter months. Ice coverage typically becomes extensive by December or January and can persist into May or even June. When the ice is thick and stable, it would provide a walkable surface connecting the mainland to the islands, no boat required. This alternative matters because it changes the picture of how people interacted with the Yellowstone landscape. If access to the islands occurred primarily or exclusively during winter, it suggests that the people using Yellowstone Lake were not summer visitors avoiding the harsh cold season conditions. They were present during the most physically demanding season, navigating a frozen lake at high altitude in temperatures that could kill an underprepared person in hours. The specific discovery that sharpened this question was made in 2016 on Dot Island, one of the smaller islands in the lake. Erosion along the island's shoreline exposed buried archaeological material. Researchers recovered a large bison leg bone dated to approximately 800 years ago, found in association with obsidian flakes. Take those two pieces of evidence separately, and neither is conclusive. A bison bone, on its own, could conceivably reach an island through natural processes, carried by ice, washed by flooding, moved by some unlikely chain of events. Obsidian flakes, on their own, could theoretically be explained as naturally deposited volcanic debris, though this would be unusual in this specific context. But together, in the same deposit, on an island in the middle of a high-altitude lake, the combination is far harder to explain without human agency. Obsidian flakes are evidence of knapping, the deliberate fracturing of stone to produce tools. A bison leg bone is evidence of a large animal that was almost certainly hunted and processed on the mainland, and whose remains were transported to the island. The simplest explanation that accounts for both is that people brought them there. If this is the kind of mystery that keeps you watching, the kind where a single bone and a handful of stone flakes on a remote island can unravel an entire picture of how ancient people moved through a dangerous landscape, then subscribe to this channel. Because the deeper you go into the archaeology of places like Yellowstone, the more you realize how much of the human story we have barely begun to recover. What the Dot Island evidence ultimately illustrates is how much interpretive weight a seemingly simple archaeological assemblage can carry. Two categories of material, bone and stone, found on an island, raise questions about transportation, seasonality, subsistence, mobility, watercraft technology, winter survival, and the relationship between human communities in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. The answer to, how did a bison bone and obsidian flakes get to an island in Yellowstone Lake, is not a single fact. It is a web of connected questions, each pulling the researcher deeper into the complexity of the past. Archaeologists have not definitively resolved whether summer watercraft, winter ice travel, or both were used to reach the islands. The evidence is consistent with either possibility, and the answer may well have varied depending on time period, conditions, and the specific group involved. What is not in doubt is the conclusion. People were using these islands, and they were doing so in a landscape that modern visitors experience primarily from the safety of boardwalks and overlooks. Everything we have discussed so far belongs to the deep past, centuries or millennia removed from the present. The next discovery is barely 150 years old, and it is, in many ways, the most emotionally difficult site in Yellowstone. Near the headwaters of the Lamar River, at an elevation approaching 3,000 meters, that is roughly 9,800 feet, and approximately 25 miles from the nearest modern road, archaeologists identified a site they named the Nez Perce Mountain Bivouac. To understand what this site is, you need to know what was happening in the summer and fall of 1877. That year, several bands of the Nez Perce people, men, women, children, elderly, were engaged in what has become known as the Nez Perce War, or the Flight of the Nez Perce. Faced with a forced removal order that would have confined them to a reservation, and following the outbreak of violence, they chose to leave their homeland in what is now Idaho and seek refuge elsewhere. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and devastating episodes in the history of the American West, a running journey of more than 1,000 miles across some of the most rugged terrain in North America, pursued by multiple columns of U.S. Army forces. Their route took them through the Yellowstone region. The park had been established only 5 years earlier, in 1872, and in 1877, it was a remote, sparsely visited place. Nothing like the tourist destination it would later become. For the Nez Perce, it was not a park. It was terrain to be crossed, and crossed quickly, under the most desperate possible circumstances. The mountain terrain along the upper Lamar River drainage, at elevations near 10,000 feet, is extraordinarily difficult. Even today, with modern equipment and GPS navigation, reaching this area requires serious backcountry travel. In 1877, for families traveling with children, elderly members, horses, and whatever possessions they could carry, the crossing would have been grueling beyond what most modern visitors can easily imagine. And then someone, a century and a quarter later, found where they had stopped. The Nez Perce mountain bivouac site was identified through archaeological survey in the remote backcountry. What researchers found there reads like an inventory of a desperate camp. Components of a McClellan military saddle, the standard cavalry saddle of the era, which Nez Perce fighters had captured or acquired during earlier engagements. Cartridge casings in .44-40 caliber, consistent with Winchester rifles that the Nez Perce are documented to have carried. Metal clothing ornaments. Tin cans, the kind of preserved food containers that were in common use during the 1870s. Evidence associated with lodge poles, suggesting that some form of temporary shelter was erected. And numerous culturally modified trees. Culturally modified trees are exactly what the term implies, trees that bear evidence of deliberate human alteration. This can include bark stripping, removing sections of bark for use as food, medicine, or material, blazing, carving, or other modifications that leave permanent marks in the wood. Distinguishing cultural modification from natural damage caused by animals, weather, fire, or disease requires careful analysis of the shape, location, depth, and pattern of the marks. Natural damage tends to be irregular and follows biological or physical patterns. Cultural modification tends to produce marks that are geometrically distinct, straight cuts, rectangular strips, consistent depths, and that occur at heights and locations consistent with human reach and intent. What makes the Nez Perce mountain bivouac site so unusual is not any single artifact. It is the convergence of multiple lines of evidence in a location that corresponds precisely with the documented historical route of the Nez Perce flight through Yellowstone. The .44-40 cartridges match weapons known to have been carried by Nez Perce fighters. The McClellan saddle components are consistent with equipment captured from Army forces. The tin cans fit the period. The modified trees, when their growth rings are analyzed, can provide approximate dates for the alterations. And the site's location, remote, high altitude, along a route that historians have reconstructed from military reports, survivor accounts, and geographical analysis, fits the documented movement of the Nez Perce bands through this specific drainage. When all of these individual pieces are assembled, they do not just suggest a connection to the 1877 flight. They make alternative explanations increasingly difficult to sustain, and the site's extreme isolation is almost certainly the reason it survived. Most 19th century campsites in the American West were subsequently disturbed, built over by later settlers, plowed under by farmers, picked over by artifact collectors, eroded by road construction, or simply trampled beyond recognition. The Nez Perce mountain bivouac is 25 miles from the nearest road, at nearly 10,000 feet of elevation, in terrain that discourages casual visitation. The factors that made it a difficult place to camp in 1877 are the same factors that kept it largely undisturbed for the next century and more. The result is something close to an archaeological time capsule, not a perfectly preserved snapshot. Natural processes have still been at work, but a site where the spatial relationships between artifacts, features, and landscape have remained far more intact than would be typical for a site of this age and type. It is important to keep the human reality at the center of this. The objects found at the bivouac were not left behind by anonymous historical actors. They were left by specific people, Nez Perce families, during one of the most desperate journeys in American history. The saddle parts were from a military saddle used by people fleeing the military that designed it. The food cans were eaten by people who did not know whether they would survive the following day. The modified trees were altered by hands that needed material for immediate, practical survival. This was not an abandoned campsite in the abstract sense. It was a place where people stopped because they could not go any further that day, in a mountain landscape that was trying to kill them almost as aggressively as the army behind them. We end in a place that most Yellowstone visitors have actually seen, even if they did not realize what they were looking at. Near Mammoth Hot Springs, in the developed area that serves as the park's administrative headquarters, lies a historical cemetery associated with Fort Yellowstone. Most people know that Yellowstone was the world's first national park, established in 1872. Fewer know that for a significant portion of its early history, the park was managed and protected not by civilian rangers, but by the United States Army. Beginning in 1886, Army troops were stationed in Yellowstone to prevent poaching, control vandalism, enforce regulations, and maintain infrastructure. Fort Yellowstone, near Mammoth Hot Springs, was their base. The soldiers and civilians who lived at Fort Yellowstone did not visit the park. They resided in it, year-round, through winters that brought temperatures of 30 or 40 below zero, through seasons of isolation when the nearest significant town was days of travel away. They did their jobs, maintained buildings and roads, patrolled the backcountry on horseback and on skis, and dealt with the ordinary realities of 19th century life in one of the most remote postings in the American military. Some of them died there. Between approximately 1888 and 1916, at least 54 people were buried in the Fort Yellowstone Cemetery. They included military personnel, enlisted soldiers and non-commissioned officers, as well as civilian employees of the Army and members of military families. The causes of death reflected the full range of hazards present in a remote, high-altitude, late 19th and early 20th century environment. Disease, accidents, exposure, and the ordinary medical emergencies that, in an era before antibiotics and modern surgery, could easily prove fatal even in less isolated settings. In 1917, the remains of 19 individuals were exhumed and transferred to Custer National Cemetery near the Little Bighorn battlefield in Montana. This was not unusual for the era. Military remains were frequently relocated to centralized national cemeteries as part of broader federal policy. But not everyone was moved. At least some of the original burials were never exhumed. They remain in the ground at or near Mammoth Hot Springs. How do we know this? Through a combination of historical records, archaeological research, and park management documentation. Burial registers from the Fort Yellowstone period provide names, dates, and sometimes causes of death. Historical maps show the cemetery's location and layout. Some surface evidence, markers, depressions, boundary features, remains visible or was visible at various points in the past. And archaeological and geophysical techniques, ground-penetrating radar for example, can locate subsurface anomalies consistent with burial shafts without requiring excavation. The National Park Service treats the Fort Yellowstone Cemetery as both a historical resource and an archaeological site. This dual classification reflects the reality that the cemetery contains not only documented burials with known identities, but also potential unmarked or inadequately documented graves that may require archaeological methods to locate and interpret. Investigation of cemeteries within national parks follows strict protocols. The goal is almost always to learn as much as possible without disturbing the remains. Excavation of human burials is a last resort, undertaken only when graves face imminent threat from erosion, construction, or other destructive processes. In most cases, the combination of historical documentation, surface survey, and non-invasive technology can provide substantial information about a cemetery's history, layout, and condition. The people buried at Fort Yellowstone lived through a transitional period in the park's history. They were there before the National Park Service existed, before the tourist infrastructure that defines the modern visitor experience was built, before Yellowstone became the symbol of American conservation it is today. They experienced the park not as a destination, but as a home that happened to sit on top of one of the most geologically active landscapes on Earth. And their presence raises a thought that is quietly unsettling, not because it is gruesome, but because it is so easy to overlook. Thousands of people drive through the Mammoth Hot Springs area every day during peak season. They visit the terraces, they photograph elk on the parade ground, They stop at the visitor center and the general store. And almost none of them know that beneath the surface, within a short walk of where they are standing, lie the remains of people who lived and died in Yellowstone when the park was still an experiment, when the geysers were protected by soldiers, and when a posting to this remote volcanic plateau was not a vacation, but a commitment that sometimes ended in a grave that was never moved. Here is what Yellowstone looks like when you strip away the geysers, the supervolcano, and the Instagram overlooks. It looks like an 11,000-year-old weapon lying on a lakeshore. It looks like 59 quarries cut into volcanic glass, connected by chemical fingerprints to sites 1,000 miles away. It looks like 11 stone circles that most hikers would walk past without a second thought, each one the ghost of a home. It looks like a line of stones stretching nearly 200 meters across a mountainside, placed there by people who understood animal psychology well enough to engineer a hunt across open terrain. It looks like a bison bone and a scatter of obsidian on a lake island, asking a question that archaeologists are still working to answer. It looks like a desperate camp at 10,000 feet, preserved by the same remoteness that made it agonizing to reach. And it looks like a cemetery near a tourist parking lot, where the dead have been lying in the ground since before the National Park Service existed. None of this is forbidden knowledge, but almost none of it is the knowledge that visitors take home. The volcanic spectacle of Yellowstone is genuine and extraordinary. The supervolcano is real. The geothermal features are astonishing, but they have created an illusion that the landscape's most important story is geological. It is not. The most important story is human. It stretches back more than 100 centuries, and it includes people who mined, hunted, traveled, sheltered, fought, fled, served, and died in a place that most of the world now thinks of as scenery. If you found this worth watching, share it with someone who thinks they already know what Yellowstone is. The archaeology suggests they are missing most of the story. And the story, unlike the magma beneath the surface, is not hiding. It is simply waiting for someone to look.